Yeah.
Oops.
I want to welcome everybody. We're about to, in a few minutes, we're going to start a recording session of an episode of the podcast, PoemTalk. Of the 135 or 140 episodes we've recorded, only 2 or 3 have been done live. I think our group has done most of them. We did one on Baraka a year ago, which we really enjoyed. It was a great episode, I think, if I may say so. And we decided to do it again, but this time we thought, instead of celebrating someone who couldn't be here, as was the case for Baraka,
he had other commitments.
We would not only celebrate a living contemporary
Transfers were not
eminence, that we would see if we could get her to come here, and we were able to do that. So we're spending the day with Erica Hunt, and we should put our hands together right at the start. Erica, I'm going to say a word or two to set this up, but I also wanted to note right away that the reading tonight will be at 6 p.m. here in the room. It's going to be a really great reading, so it'll be Erica reading. We also have both now and tonight, but I would do it tonight because I would do it now because tonight's going to be a little busier. We have 2 books for sale. This is just out, Veronica, Suite in X parts or 10 parts.
Yeah. X parts.
X parts.
Oh, it is X parts?
It is
X,
yeah.
And I'll tell you about the timing of this session in a minute because you're going to want to see if you can get Eric to inscribe your book, and it may have to wait for.
And here they all are.
The book have arrived by hand.
Right.
That's so cool.
Thank you.
And then there's this amazing book,
Thank you.
Letters to the Future, Black Women, Radical
I'm
Writing,
teaching that right now.
Oh, good.
which Erica edited with Don Lundy Martin, and it is available as well for sale at price, whatever we got it for. We're not making any profit because we don't. This book will be available as well
On
tonight.
principle.
Here's the timing today. In a minute or two, we're going to start the podcast. It's okay if you kind of go in and out. Zach is really handling the audio from here, so it's okay to make a tiny bit of noise. It's best if you don't make a huge amount of noise because we'll get onto the. But I'm going to say at the beginning of the podcast that we're before a live audience, I'm going to ask you to put your hands together so people listening to the recording can know it's a live audience. It's okay if you're a little noisy. Feel free to come and go with your lunch. When we start, we're going to go through. We're going to talk in a lively way, I know, about a poem of Erica's. That'll all be self-explanatory after a while. And then once the poem talk stops, and that'll be probably about 45 minutes in, or 50, we'll turn the recording off, or we'll keep the recording going, but we will turn to Q&A. So you guys can get involved in the conversation. And we need to vacate this room at 1:15 because there's a class being taught in here at 1:30, but I think that should give us enough time to do the poem talk and to have the Q&A. So, any questions about this? Thank you for coming. You guys are ready. Just want to warn my people here, resist the temptation to give mini lectures. Short answers, responding to each other, and so forth.
No. Right. Like
No
that? No.
Okay. And don't forget the Gathering Paradise at the end, which is a chance to recommend. And I got my recommendation already. I just read this. It's so good. This is Tyrone's new book, As Is.
A little premature with the recommendation, aren't you?
Oh yeah, I got. Okay, right. Okay, Zach, are we ready? All right. And by the way, we are filming this, but though primarily it's an audio podcast. I'm Al Phil. You're laughing already on the soundtrack? That, for the record, that was Tyrone. I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening some friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our PennSound archive, writing.upenn.edu/PennSound. Today, we're here for a special episode of PoemTalk in the Arts Cafe of the Kelly Writers House, joined by an in-person audience whose presence I hope they will confirm right now by putting their hands together. Thank you. That's so sweet of you. Let the record show they're eating lunch while applauding. It's not an easy thing to do. You have to do some lap work to do that. And your applause is going to help me welcome our poem talkers today. Yes, Yes, do put your hands together. It's totally okay to applaud each of these fabulous people as I introduce them. First, we are honored to have with us Tyrone Williams. Tyrone Williams, everybody. Among whose many books of poetry are On Spec, The Hero Project of the Century, Adventure of Pi, CC, and Hal, who teaches literature and theory at Xavier University in Cincinnati, who's the editor of African American Literature Revised Edition, and whose new book is As Is, Poems About Islam and the West that form a meditation on the vacillation between betweenness and amongness. And by William J. Billy Joe Harris over here, who has been writing a chapbook of imitations and afters of Sappho and Catullus. Sappho he deems a blues poet, and Catullus a vernacular poet, whose chapbook's in the works, and he'll have to update us on this. The last I checked included one consisting of Lucifer poems, who is in the process of writing poems with cartoons, has been studying Kenneth Patchen, William Blake, who for many years a professor at Kansas, is now a Brooklyn, New York resident, and continues as a member of the jazz faculty seminars at Columbia University. And by Aldon Nielsen, right over there, Aldon Nielsen. Poet, critic, editor, literary historian, whose books include What I Say, Innovative Poetry by Black Writers in America, Trey, an amazing, totally amazing book of poems, A Brand New Beggar, poems of and about blues travelers. You didn't hear this from me, C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction, Black Chant, Languages of African American Postmodernism, and recently with Laura Vrana, has co-edited, we are happy to say, and he's holding it up, the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas. Yes, Wesleyan, October 2019. What an achievement. And we are joined also by Erica Hunt. Poet, activist, grantor, former grantor, institution builder, leader, who works at the forefront of experimental poetry and poetics, critical race theory, and feminist aesthetics, whose books also include Arcade, Peace Logic, Local History, and Time Slips Right Before Your Eyes, and whose essays include, among many, Notes for an Oppositional Poetics, and whose newest publication will be, hear it now, Jump the Clock, New and Selected Poems. Mm-hmm, yes, congratulations. Coming. So, yeah. Erica, thank you so much. Congrats on the new and selected. Thanks so much for making the journey here.
Yes, my pleasure.
It's good to see you. Aldon, as always, hi. How are you?
I'm sorry. We're sort of evil twins. We are both the Kelly professor of something. Different Kellys.
We're the Kelly professor at Penn State.
But we're mirror images. I'm the larger, fatter image of the...
We're both photographers. Anyway, thank you, Al, for complicating. You're supposed to just say, hi, Al. It's nice to be here.
I haven't said hi for 37 years.
Okay, sorry. Billy Joe Harris, it's good to see you as always. I've listened to our last conversation, and at the beginning of the last conversation, I noted that you had just then turned 75, which is astonishing to me. And then I said, well. you look a year younger every year when I see you. And I think it's happened again, right? Don't we have a response to this? Hi.
Hi.
How are you? And Tyrone Williams, good to see you as always. Thank you for making the trip. Well, today we have gathered here to talk about a poem by Erica Hunt that is included in her book, Time Slips Right Before Your Eyes, published by Belladonna in 2006. And there's a kind of new version, different publication story that I'm sure will emerge, but the one I have is Belladonna 2006. The poem that we're going to talk about is called Should You Find Me? And it is the piece with which this powerful book of family history concludes. Mm-hmm. Erica's fabulous PennSound page, which includes recordings of her readings and performances dating back to, Erica, guess what the earliest one is?
82.
Yeah, close. It's 1983 is the earliest recording. And as recent, these recordings on PennSound, as March 2019, this page happens not to include a reading of this poem. So we're asking Erica to read it now And it will be added not just to this podcast, but to the PennSound page. So here is Erica Hunt herself performing Should You Find Me?
Should you find me? Should you find me? I'm the short one on the left, knocking brown against green hills, a fleck in the crowd, not to be blinked on or peeled, coming off with the tape. Should you find me, would you have a word for me? Or do I go forward on faith for a new word, a different spelling? Where would you find me? At the top of residential grids, in the tear downs and the private cul-de-sacs? Or at the bottom, in the nameless streets where pavement dwellers tap into the futility lines for brown-out power? Where would you find me? Oh, which kidnap do you mean, you ask? In security chambers, handcuffed, the soundless zeros, maximum cancellations of futurity? In the mall's maw thrall of fear-numbing card-bearing youth? Or in abandoned villages among smoking ruins patrolled by Uzi-besotted soldiers? When the codes change, does the energy suck remain the same? Would I recognize my name in the voice calling from the burning bush? Would I hold my breath and hope it wasn't me being called from the burning bush? And if it isn't me, who else will carry the tune? If you should find me, would I have to relearn my own name, talk to the letters in the alphabet one by one, my new best friends? Would I have to invent spillover? There's got to be more days in the year. Birthdays shouldn't be rationed. We need new shoes. We need to replace perpetual war footing. If you should find me, does that mean the pop quiz in the picture? Rebus times pantomime, tariffs, pygmy? Would I button down? Do fewer wrinkles in the forehead automatically lead to new wrinkles in the knees? If you should find me, could I stop doing? Red onions, beets, radishes, peppers. Then who would restore the color to crunch? Everyone knows it's not easy to hold things still. The red and its expectation, the bell and its clapper, the beat to its sugar. Should you find me, how could I miss? Who would I miss? Who would miss me? If you should find me, I would measure as it has taken me time to learn how. Practicing a long view. The pinch, a pause, punctuation in the moment.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. What a... When we chose to discuss this poem somewhat collaboratively, I suggested it. Everybody thought it was a great idea. It struck me that it was, or maybe it was Tyrone who said in an email, this seems to really be a summation of a great coda to the whole chapbooks, and so no doubt we'll be talking about that. But let's focus on the poem first. Should you find me as a refrain? Aldon first, and then Erica. Let's talk about the you in Should You Find Me. This is a really powerful, almost visionary you. Aldon, you first. Any thoughts on you?
I'm going to cheat again. Since we were cautioned against doing mini lectures, I was actually going to start before that with the verb tense because
Yes.
I've been fascinated for decades now by Erica Hunt's fascination with time and tense. Those of you who don't have a copy of the poem in front of you don't know that she actually changed the verb tense of one of the words in the very last stanza as she was reading it right now. But should, would, and could all appear, and of course they have to do with the you, which we'll circle back to when she corrects me in a minute. But they're all conditionals, they're all future oriented, but this is one of the oddest openings in all of Erica's work, or really anybody's work. If it had started out, would you find me, the sense would be that you might at some point in the future go looking for her. Should implies a different kind of conditionality, but the surprise is that she's already been found in the very next clause, because you're already, should you find her, you've already found this photograph and you're looking to her. And in fact, if you've been following her work, she's been up to this kind of strange exploration of language and time all along. And I believe she's already invented a term for this verb tense in the first book, surplus future imperfect. Which I think also makes the you to cut
finally
myself
get to
short.
Al's question.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think this makes the you an interesting case of a future conditional as well. I've talked for many years now about the future interior in African American literature, and of course we could go back to the verb noun binaries in Stein and Baraka and so many others over the years. But I really want to kind of hold on this question of the futurity of this you who is going to come and look for, if I could paraphrase Elijah Muhammad, the lost found. I, me, you, that's already there in the photograph.
Erica, thoughts on the you? I mean, there's so many ways you works. One, of course, would be readers of this book, or anyone else who's not part of this family could also refer to oneself. So how would you deal with that?
Yeah, this poem is about time, and it is also about kind of how photos capture specific moments in the past, and how they also summon all the feelings and experience of when that photo was taken. So, but the time of the photo that's described in this is, it's actually panoptic, right? So there's many different possible scenes, and thus that weird word, should you,
I'm hoping that in a minute we can, all five of us, find some of the time stamps in the poem. I heard a World War II one. We could go on and on, but I'd like to do that. But first, Tyrone and then Billy Joe, let's get to find. So there's something about discerning, finding, locating, seeing, identifying. Tyrone, what do you do? This is a poem about finding a me.
Well, on that point, one of the things I thought about this poem, and by the way, I should say that I believe I'm the only one with this particular version of the chapbook.
Can you describe it? I mean, what is it? Is it a belladonna?
Should you describe it? How
just
would
an
you?
early.
It's a belladonna book, but it's a different version of the.
So that's the 2006 version?
I don't know.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Okay, but anyway, but it doesn't matter because of what I thought about "Should You Find Me" is particularly in relationship to the entire chapbook. Someone who doesn't want to be found is one way I thought about this poem, in that someone who's, if you will, in hiding, or if you will, sort of focused on the future, and that this notion of being found seems to suggest, speaking of photos, a kind of entrapment. I mean, that's one way I interpreted this notion of "should you find me," that, particularly if you read through the poem, it suggests that the poet or the narrator is concerned about the sort of framing containment that would occur once found.
Mm-hmm. Billy Joe, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the me. It's like there are lots of different ways we can define the me, as we've talked about. But one thing, you could define the me as a writer. And I think this passage, which I particularly like, is, "I recognize my name in the voice calling from the burning." No, I'm sorry. "Would I recognize my name in the voice calling from the burning bush?" So that throughout there's this sort of playfulness and feeling, not a powerful being. So you have the whole image of the burning bush. Would I recognize my name and the voice calling from the burning bush? And then there is, would I hold my breath and hope it wasn't me? So there's that wonderful sort of like, this is in the tradition, this big thing, the burning bush calling you out, and am I going to be sort of shy? Am I going to pretend it's not me? But then, and if it isn't me, who else will carry the tune?
Oh my
I
gosh.
find that incredible in
Yeah.
terms of, okay, I got some really powerful stuff to say.
To paraphrase is truly a sin in a poem like this, but it's my job sometimes to ask. And since Erica, you began to paraphrase that stanza, but I wonder if maybe we can start with Erica, which is this is a double sin, asking the poet to paraphrase. I'll start us off and tell me if I'm getting it wrong. At first, I wonder if this visionary, ecstatic moment, I would even recognize myself as being included in it. But then if I did, I think I'd like to dodge it, right? And then another option, which is so profound, I turn over to you now, Erica. If it isn't me, then who else is going to carry the tune? There's a kind of an acceptance of you're the one who has to
It's an
be
interesting
the...
image you just used.
Well, the burning bush is a reference, obviously, to Moses in the burning bush. And if we recall that story, Moses was very ambivalent about answering because this is a supernatural occurrence. And his name is being called from the bush. And he has to really think it over because he's actually trying to hide out. So this, in some ways, this is about whether or not to, that line is, the voice of, we have lots of voices, poets, right? We're constantly absorbing the language and, vernacular and choices and so forth. And this is about the choice to step up or not, to be found or not. And in a world which is quite a mess, it's like messy to step up. And the world depicted in the poem is messy,
And you've always been an activist. You've always been someone who wants to identify the self in the poem as someone who does things as well as writes things. So I'm going to turn to Aldon to formulate this into a question, which is, this really is about the Erica Hunt or the self that moves through this family and identifies herself as someone who came from somewhere and has to do something in response. Is that an overreading of the way this burning bush stanza works to sort of encourage this person to step up and do stuff in the world that Erica just described as needing help?
You're asking me if that's an overreading?
I am, actually. I am. We've been through this before.
Well, having come through the last 4 or 5 decades of theory, the only way you could produce an overreading would be produce something that couldn't be connected to the text in any way, shape, or form. So obviously not.
Thanks. That was kind of a low standard. But
Yeah, I've sort of thrown that term out along with overwriting. But to quote from Arcade, people make, and it's intriguing that that's in quotation parts.
And once you mention what Arcade is.
It's a book. By
An amazing book.
From Kelsey Street Press with a collaborative project with Alison Sarr. Beautiful artwork all the way through. But anyway, people make the people around them, and they write to write the reader out of retreat.
Say that again. Read that again,
have to
if you
find
wouldn't
it
mind.
again.
Oh,
I got it right here. I actually did mark the spot. Or I thought I marked the spot. People make, in quotation marks, the people around them. I did remember that. And they write to write the reader out of retreat. Now, that's just the first part of a sentence. It goes on from there. But again, had we had time to do many lectures, I was going to go on about the gaze and the whole question of subjectivity by being seen by others and seen by oneself and so forth. But there's a calling out. You use the term calling out, not in the contemporary sense of calling people out because of whatever they've just done, but in the sense of the call that a Levinas or Fanon might talk about. The bush calls to you. You ask it what its name is. It asks you things. It asks things of you, and so forth and so on. So one of the intriguing things about Letters to the Future is in Erica's introduction, she talks about the futurity of any writing, which is true, not just of poetry, but any writing at all has that property of futurity attached to it. So we are constantly being called into ourselves and into our future by being recognized, by being called by others. Although when you find yourself being called by a seemingly inanimate object, I think you're in a different territory.
Tyrone, right after that crisis, we get a really powerful stanza that begins, if you should find me, would I have to relearn my own name? Talk to the letters in the alphabet one by one, my new best friends. It may or may not follow. These may not be sequential stanzas. But if it is sequential, what's happening there now? There's something about memory, which is an important part of this whole book going on. And we didn't use the word invisibility earlier, but I think the speaker is struggling with how visible to be and what are the dangers of being very visible so that God could call you out as the one who's going to save everybody.
That's my messianic
Take
moment.
that anywhere, Tyrone.
Okay. So I have because I have a different version of that. I mean,
Is the
again,
line
That would be an
different?
excuse for
I think so. Yeah.
You want to read the version
Yeah.
you have in
Which
front of you?
one is it?
If you should find me, would I have to relearn my own name?
No, okay. Talk to letters. No, that's the same. One by one, my new best friends. Is that part? Is
Yeah,
the same?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, again, the way I read that particular line, like the way I read this particular poem, is this sense of starting over. The narrator will have to start over, become someone else, in the same way that we become someone else once we take on new responsibilities, which is also a part of, at least my version of the poem, this notion of taking on, toward the end, new responsibilities. If you should find me, new responsibilities, but find me too, still weeks away from vacation. In other words, that once found, you have obligations. Once found, you have responsibilities. Once found, you have to do for others. And so there's this struggle between this sense of, not just in terms of family, but in terms of other obligations, work, and others too. I mean, I'm sorry, I'll just stop there.
Erica, what Tyrone said I found very moving because I keep thinking about this person. This is the last poem in a book about someone's family history and mostly a matrilinear set of stories. And so should you find me is specifically about an old photograph of oneself. And so if you put that together with Tyrone's comment, it would be at that moment of needing to accept responsibility, having gone back to get the matrilineage set up for yourself, and then find that you have to relearn your name. It's a powerful moment. Can you describe that moment?
I can describe the conditions under which I wrote this chapbook, which was that I had 2 children, a partner, who's here, it's great, Marty, a job that went on for 50, 60 hours a week, in which, the mission was to catalyze Black community social change and transformation.
The 21st Century
21st
Project.
Century Foundation, and it was to raise a lot of money. And I was also a poet. So all these things were going on simultaneously. As a Black woman who grew up working class and found herself middle class, I felt like I had to do 3 times what I need, to basically just to be, and just to actually do justice and to honor the people who brought me here. And this family history, the pictures that are in this chapbook are the people who brought me here. And I then realized that looking into their composed faces, there was just the same level of work, energy, stress, resilience going on that I was currently feeling. So this poem is in some ways, yes, the you is both the reader and it's also me. And where am I in this? How am I a poet still?
How do I find myself? Yeah.
How do I find that?
In my own writing.
And so there's that, tremendous kind of, challenge of saying, I can step into being a writer because all these folks brought me here to be that writer. You know, that's what they all were working for. They saw it and they didn't know they were seeing it. So, but that's what I'm obliged to be. So should you find me, that tense of should is indicates the consequence of an imagined event, and I am its consequence.
Erica and then
lot
Billy
of
Joe,
events.
the title of the chapbook and also the title of a memoiristic poem in the book is Time Slips Right Before the Eyes. In a way, the title is a gloss of the poem we're talking about, or the poem that we're talking about is a gloss on the title. We could have done a poem talk about that phrase, time slips right before the eyes. I'm going to ask you if you don't mind saying something about that, and then Billy Joe, yeah, you. I mean, you're asking us in a way to remember that we're looking at a photo of the poet, you know, as a younger person sometimes, and of her family. And how could it slip right before the eyes? Right before the eyes is an idiom that suggests it's there. You got to see it. Yeah.
There's a great book right now by the name of Listening to Pictures. It's by the Black photography historian Tina Kampft. In a way, what I was trying to do in this book was to listen to the pictures. These are old family pictures, and so I was trying to see if I could see something beyond the surface pose. So to just give you, the audience at least, a sense, this is a very formal picture, right? But but behind that, there's a life. And so it's how to, to begin to sense some of the life behind some of these formal pictures. So time slips, there's a slipperiness to it, but there's also a desire to sort of also get to some level of immersion or understanding, legibility of the people and of the experiences behind those photos.
Since we have the poet here,
Yes.
this photograph is, at the bottom, is you and a brother, or not at all?
It's not the
at
photo
all.
in the poem.
Earlier generation, I think.
Very
Earlier
earlier
generation.
earlier,
Okay.
much earlier.
The photo
These-
in the poem isn't in the book.
Yeah, the photo. There's no photo of me in this. These are all pictures, pretty much from the beginning of the 20th century,
Okay.
of various relatives, some whom I don't even know because the people who could identify them are gone. So, but it was trying to get to some reading of them.
Okay, that's great. And maybe when we do our interview, we can come back to that,
Yes.
because I was really interested. The photo,
Yes.
They were there,
Yes,
but I didn't. They aren't. They
they're
are
not. They're
they
not
aren't-
identified or,
right.
or
And because
dated.
people are dead. That's
Yes,
no.
they're dead. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We're slipping into the book, but time slips right before the eyes. The past is imperfect, thus story. And that seems to do a great deal. You're looking at these photographs, and how are you interpreting these photographs, and you're interpreting them, you're creating stories about them.
Yes. Yes.
And the first line of that great poem, she said, "Did I ever tell you this story?" Which,
Oh, yeah.
the people watching this recording and certainly listening won't know what is about to happen or won't be able to understand this. But our live audience, raise your hand if an elder or a living ancestor has ever said to you, "Have I told you this story before?" Something really important there. So, Erica, this part is about forgetting. A story that tells and forgets, not the storyteller, but the story itself. Somebody want to talk about memory and forgetting in our poem? Billy Joe, you seem on the edge of saying something.
No.
He's just kind of on the edge.
He's just generally on the edge.
But there's a line back in the first book that is intriguing in this respect, because Erica wrote, "It is never impossible to find the perfect official photo." So the photos and the stories are going to come to a future imperfect one way or another.
Yeah.
Even if who knows if these stories are. John Edgar Whiteman titled the book "All the Stories Are True."
Yes.
So the coming together of the photo and the story produces new stories, new images, which have the truth of the family memory, if nothing
Yeah.
else. Yeah.
Erica, the third stanza is the most, for lack of a better word, socially expansive. This is the one that gets into the world that we're worried about. Wondered
yes.
if you could reread that stanza, and then I'll ask Tyrone, Aldon, and Billy Joe each to just say something briefly about it. It's a powerful stanza, the one that has the residential grids and the teardowns.
Sure. Yes. Where would you find me? At the top of residential grids? In the teardowns and the private cul-de-sacs? Or at the bottom, in the nameless streets, among pavement dwellers tapping into the futility lines for brown-out power?
Who wants to start? You want to riff on that, Tyrone?
Well, so my riff would be to read the version, which is quite different in this.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yes, so here's that version,
Okay, go ahead.
which is a kind of answer to that version. Where would you find me between the residential grids? In the teardowns, the private cul-de-sacs, security chamber handcuffs, sound, zeroes in on a day in a life, but whose life? In the mall patrolled by car-bearing youth, or in abandoned villages, smoking ruins patrolled by Uzi-bearing youth. So that's a little bit different
together.
than the line.
And
than
it
what-
ends, well,
Yeah.
than-
some of this ends up in the next stanza in this one.
Right.
right.
Where are we, and what does it have to do with looking at a family photo? I'm intrigued.
So because this version only has one, I think one. In this version, I'll just hold it up. The picture that's on the front of that version is actually on the inside of this version. Although there's another version of it, but you can barely see it on the cover here and so forth. So I say all this to say that I was not necessarily thinking of this poem or these poems, this particular poem, I should say, not only in terms of family, personal family, but rather in the larger, if you will, family of African American culture, and particularly that particular line, that particular stanza or paragraph, and the way it has been changed and expanded makes it even more clear that this is about how do you find yourself in the midst of this world?
Right. Yeah, I
that's-
think absolutely.
And that seems to me very, a part of this too, which might be part of my introduction tonight.
Let
to
the
talk a
record
little-
show we're talking about a reading that will happen later today at 6 p.m.
Yes, because I'm really interested in this question in terms of Erica's work and relationship in the way that it is and is not a part of quote unquote traditional African American culture and letters, and of course particularly poetry, and that's even more true, I think, in this book. That is that she co-edited.
And you're holding
with
up the
Dawn.
Black Women Radical Writing
Right.
anthology. Aldon, what about that
Well-
third stanza and its social landscape?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
context is everything. When I'm not teaching at Penn State, I live someplace where futility lines cause fires, where we have
Santa
blackouts,
Barbara, California.
and brownouts. But I also live in a place where there was a brown power movement, very much modeled on the Black Power movement, which I also find sort of echoing around in there. And I don't want to take up too much time with that, but to me, when we talk about social geography, we're talking about the history of these movements as well. What became of them? How much utility did they have? How much futility did they have, and so forth. But also, as a scholar, I know that both bibliographers and map makers used to do a curious thing. Map makers would put a cul-de-sac on a map that didn't exist. And the reason they did that was if you copied that map without permission, they could spot their cul-de-sac. The same thing. Well, many of us kind of historically live in these seemingly non-existent cul-de-sacs. Maybe I think this way because I lived on a cul-de-sac when I was a high school student. In the earlier version, the Uzis are in this stanza. Is that what I just heard?
right.
Yeah. You were asking about timestamps and so forth. That's one of the only really clear timestamps in the whole thing because it's an Israeli manufactured weapon. So, some of this gives us the feeling of being in the Caribbean. Some of us gives us the feeling of being a large eastern city. But if, like me, you live in California, it's familiar in a very immediate
It's
way.
today,
That's
yeah.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Except
Billy
for the
Joe.
Uzi part.
Yeah, Billy
One
Joe,
thing it
thought
seems-
on that?
Yeah,
stanza?
I do, but for the thought, it seems like when this is put up somewhere, both versions should be put up on
With Erica's permission.
with Erica's without.
Because she did revise it for a reason, probably so that this one wouldn't be talked about too much. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Al. I appreciate that. Exactly.
No, but
Right,
our
exactly.
Tyrone, our job is to do the literary historical work right in front of the poet.
Right in
Right,
front of
right, right. Lawsuit or not.
So then I should just stand up and leave because I was becoming irrelevant.
Please don't.
When
We
the
need
very
you to
Orem
do the
edition
introduction.
comes out.
Erica, I want to turn to you and frame it with a. Oh, sorry, Billy Joe. Okay. Hi, Billy
Okay.
Joe.
Your moment
Hi.
came and went.
Thanks.
Right.
Thanks for making the trip all the way from Brooklyn.
But yeah, the first thing, it is the current world, whether you're going to call it black world or not. When Aldon brought up Brown, is interesting because Brown is repeated twice. In the first stanza, oddly, knocking Brown against green hills, and you wonder what that Brown is. Brown hills, Brown what? And then Brown comes up again, and lines for brown out power, and it certainly must play with black power. and
Absolutely.
brown. So
Yeah.
that's all.
That's good. I'm glad we paused for that. Erica, I wanted to ask you about this, and I'm going to set it up with the following. There is a tradition, usually at the end of texts, in this case, the last poem, sometimes in the last paragraph of a novel, a good or a bad novel. At the very end of Song of Myself, you get a moment where the speaker says, look, I'm everywhere. I'm ubiquitous. I'm radical. I'm going to change things. If you want to find me, you look for me under your boot soles, look for me in so that's Whitman, of course, doing something very different. And there's no scene like the third stanza in Song of Myself, to say the least. Another example, and this is even whiter than that, this is John Steinbeck at the end of his communist, visionary, romantic, gloopy, right, book about Tom Joad. And he says to Ma at the end, look, it's, I finally figured out who I am, class consciousness and so forth, and if you want me, Ma says, what's going to happen to you? And he says, well, I'm going to be in, every time a kid laughs, I'm going to be there. I'm in the voice of the kid, and when the bird is flying in the tree, I'm in that bird, and there's that. This is so different. It's somewhat similar. I feel the ubiquity of your self-discovery, or the self-discovery of the speaker of this chapbook, saying, should you find me, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be in the nameless streets, and I'm not even sure what my name is when I'm there. And so there's this powerful ubiquity, but it's also very different. And that third stanza is the clue for me of being, it's not Walt Whitman at the end of Song Myself. How would you like to respond to that?
Well,
Should you respond?
should I respond? Well, I would say there is a kind of Whitmanic plenitude that's going on, but I do think it's a high and low.
Thanks.
The residential grids are the high, the pavement dwellers are the low. They're without. It is about the gaps of wealth, the gaps of opportunity. It's about the polarization of the world. And there is something, I sort of, I read and I said, well, what did I mean by this poem? I had to reconstruct my state of mind. And I realized that there is some kind of dystopia that one has to choose to face, and it's the voice of, well, am I going to face the disparities in opportunity and wealth and justice? Thus the contrasting image, the residential grids, the pavement dwellers, the security chambers, handcuffed, soundless zeros. I mean, that's pretty grim. That's to have been, caught up by the state and your future canceled. It literally says that. Or in the mall, where, happy time, I have a credit card. That's the other contrasting panopticon choice. We live in a world in which both of those things exist. And to be in the world, to be conscious, and not shut down, but to be conscious is a choice, and it's kind of it's kind of you have to rouse yourself to do it, because it's easier to kind of let it gloss over. So I paint the dystopia in the first half I think, in the first half of this poem, and it changes to a more utopian but chaotic beginning, a new beginning, as I think Aldon or Tyrone mentioned about relearning my own name, which is that beginning from scratch, and not with any guarantee or surety.
Tyrone.
That's interesting because, again, I want to read from my now irrelevant version of this. The way it ends, much more in a much more, shall we say, negative way to a certain extent. And also, for me, it definitely looks forward to Veronica Sweet and X Parts.
Yeah.
These times are brittle and we are frail, even as we cup hands over eyes, our mouths, our ears. So that's the way the original version.
Could you read that again?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Put your glasses back on.
My glasses back on. These times are brittle and we are frail, even as we cup hands over eyes, our mouths, our ears. See no, hear no evil,
That's
as it
it.
were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do is go around all the way around, so we'll have to be brief twice. The first time, I'd like to ask each of us to toss out some kind of historical marker that gives us a sense of timestamp. And the reason I think that's important is this strikes me as a very powerful poem about multi-generational considerations and about history. And it's pretty subtle. It's not overtly a historical document, but there's some hints to the various times we're talking about. So I wonder if we would just start with Aldon. What's a hint about a time here?
I already gave away the Uzi one. Well, here's another one that may not have the same kind of personal connections to others that it does for me. In the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I believe it's the 8th stanza at the end, there's a reference. You have to see this to get it, because what you hear is the beat to its sugar, but it's B-E-E-T. And of course, you might also hear B-E-A-T in that context. Sugar beets might be coming back a little bit now, but they were huge in the United States in the mid-20th century, particularly following the revolution in Cuba. There was literally no reason for anybody to be making beet sugar anymore, given the economics of sugar production in the mid-20th century. But once we threw an embargo on Cuba, suddenly there was this big boost to the sugar beet industry. Well, as a child, I happened to live near a sugar beet factory with railroads and everything and the smells and so forth and so on. So I remember sugar beets. I don't spend time in organic food places. Are people using sugar beets again now? Do you know?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. But that really gives it that
That's a great
time
example.
before, say, 1958 or so.
That is a great example. Who's got one? Tyrone.
Excuse me, in my version, is that
You're really pushing this.
well, you started
I
it.
opened the door.
Exactly.
It's the King James to our revised standard.
Right.
So I'll just read this stanza. If you should find me, need I carry a sign with me to explain my place under the circumstances, my arrival by car in my time travel dress with a Peter Pan collar,
There you go.
Dodge Dart background.
Another
grinning-
one.
Right, grinning for the
Yeah.
company in the next century.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I've got one. I mentioned it earlier. The rationing. Birthdays shouldn't be rationed. We need new shoes. We need to replace perpetual war footing. That feels, it could be a Korean War scene, but it's more likely
World War
rationing
II.
is World War II. And so that's what Erica or the speaker is thinking about after really going back through all the family documents and thinking about really deprivation times 2. So if you're already a family that experiences precarity and then there's rationing and a war footing, it becomes that much harder. And it's not an overt reference to it, but it is one. Billy Joe, you got a timestamp?
Yes, they've already have been said. The residential grids, that's contemporary. Malls, that's really more like 70s than now,
Yeah.
because they're gone now.
Erica? Did you find one?
Soundless zeros, the security chamber. Handcuffed soundless zeros, maximum cancellations of futurity. So that's the Iraq War.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a chance now for final thoughts from each of you. One thing that you came to this session, and some of you came long distances, all four of you did, something you wanted to say but haven't had a chance yet. Briefly, who wants to start? Tyrone, a final thought? We can come back to you.
Yeah, come back.
Okay, Aldon, a final thought?
Well, I'll just go back to the very final words of this, and the first words that I started out with, having to do with the way we mark time, the way we try to understand time, and eventually understand that time is in fact a creation of our own language. And at the end of this poem, she talks about a pause, punctuation in the moment. Punctuation being that invisible marking that still has to do with time, says her, and so forth and so on. Photographs are kind of punctuated in a way, and they punctuate our memories and so forth. So I found that a really, whether it was the original last word or not, it is punctuation at the moment. I also wanted to just say one last thing, to change religious frames. There's this great old gospel song, I told Jesus be all right if he changed my name. And that whole question, the worst thing you can do to someone is call them out their name. And without ever hearing a name in this poem, the question of the naming and renaming keeps coming up again and
That's
again.
great. Thank you. Tyrone, you ready for a final thought?
Well, if we had more time to talk about another poem from the chapbook,
Which is totally different, right? No.
which is what right. It would be the poem "Into Deep," which ends, and it's the last line of this poem that struck me when I first read it. Only a noose, so permanent ink in the score. Only a noose could be so tight, and that has to do with the one thing we didn't talk about is the question of music. And the role that it plays along, and throughout the chapbook and so forth.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up. Billy Joe, final thought?
Final thought about this poem, the book, and Veronica is how Erica is making language strange and sometimes sort of very mundane, like residential grids get pulled into it. So I've been thinking a lot about Erica and language, and in the afterword to Veronica, Evie Shockley says that she tangles with language, as her work always has. From its opening lines, for instance, it demonstrates how stretchy, how sticky pronouns can be. I think you can move it from let's try again. I think you can move it from pronouns to the language. And I love that she uses stretchy, sticky, which I like better than make it strange.
Yeah, that's great, Billy Joe. Thank you. Erica Hunt, final thought on your own poem?
So I'm so glad we discussed this poem because it brought me back to revisit what exactly generated the poem, and to think that in some ways a turning point to decide to step into something, to step into a role, and step into the calling. Should you find me? Yeah, I got found or found myself. It found me. How I got here. And yet I was found and compelled to write more. So thank
That's lovely.
Thank you for the time you've spent with the poem.
It's been great.
It's been a great pleasure.
My final thought has to do with another poem which I'm simply recommending in this chapbook. It's Mood Librarian, which is in many parts. I'm just going to read 3 of the parts. Mood Librarian, part 16. Birds purpose the air as you purpose pen and paper. 52. And this is one of Erica's many, many talents as a poet is to mess up cause and effect and to reverse cause and effect. So 52. Wake the stone. Call back the atoms. And 55, which I think is about writing as well. 55. Broken glass subsumed into the bottle, which is another one of those. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world. Who's ready to gather some paradise? You forgot we were going to do this? Oh, you want to recommend that? Go
Yeah.
ahed, please. Billy Joe.
Yeah, I certainly forgot. But that wasn't
How many times have we done this?
but I really recommend, and I've read it, Veronica, A Suite in X parts. I thought it was cool, and I thought it was 10 parts. And something about she and Fred Moten read a couple weeks ago, and it just reads out loud, just beautifully, powerfully. And something we talk about Erica being a politically engaged poet, and something that comes across in these particular poems is a black mother mourning for or lamenting the death of so many young black men, often by police, and it just haunts the book.
Thank you for that recommendation. Tyrone, gather some paradise.
Sorry, I was paying attention to.
You were thinking about that one, yeah.
You're right.
He has a different version of Parrot.
Right.
You're never going to let him forget this.
Exactly. No. Are you kidding? I can't think of anything
Good happening in the poetry world.
Yeah, exactly. There usually isn't much good happening in the poetry world. But
Like a whole bunch of poets in the audience here. You're making them feel really good.
right, exactly.
We can come back if I bet somebody else says will trigger a feeling that there's something good that you've been reading lately.
Well, I can tell you one book I've been reading lately that I really like is Jill Maggie's new book from Nightboat, Speech.
Yeah,
It's very interesting, very good. I
that's
like it a
great.
lot.
Great recommendation.
Oh.
Thank you. You pulled that one out. Aldon, Nielsen.
Billy Joe's taking my books away.
Oh,
from me.
take it. Oh no, you. I
we-
didn't want to embarrass
We
you. so
already
I was
we
gonna-
already recommended the collected poems of Lorenzo Thompson.
Look, we've never had a poem talk like this.
But, yeah,
It's totally breaking apart at the seams.
Maybe there will be
My
no more live
powers of
ones.
moderation have completely failed.
I do have one though. This is why you should always go to poetry readings by poets you've never heard of. Last February, I was in Brooklyn for the book to read at the Boog City Festival, and I stayed over an extra day. I went down to the Bowery Poetry Club to see what was happening with poets I'd never heard of. And I was really struck by the work of Lauren Russell, who lives in Pittsburgh right now. And she has this wonderful book called What's Hanging on the Hush. I never knew how to pronounce the name of the press, Asata or something like that,
Asata.
which apparently may disappear soon. So do get this book, What's Hanging on the Hush. It is a beautiful piece of work, touching on many of the subjects that we were touching on today by a new
Great.
poet.
Great recommendation. Erica Hunt, final thought. No, we've already done final thoughts. Gathering Paradise.
You're losing it, too.
I'm losing it.
Right. My friend says that I'm crushing. I'm crushing on Ann Boyer right now. And her essay No, which I like a lot. And then she has another poem. She has a poem about the grave. How it's not the grave. What's the name of that poem? It's been. That's what I was looking to see if I could find the reference. So I'm crushing on her. But I've also been teaching Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, and I highly recommend that as well. So.
Fantastic. My Gathering Paradise is, I'm gathering the paradisal work of this person sitting to my left, Tyrone Williams. This is a book called As Is, or I guess we can say As Is, Aziz, Aziz, As Is, A-S-I-Z. It's fantastic, and I just thought I would, and I'm crushing on 3 or 4 poems in this book, and I've got one called Tao, that I wondered if you would read as my Gathering
That I would
Paradise.
read?
Yeah, would you? Got to get the glasses.
Yeah, exactly. Tao. Out here, the affluenza of crude salt airs out, a spread of trade wind humors, the drone of an ambient language, flash firefight, the power state, an antecedent modifier, speak English, prepare to be boarded, to come aboard, all hope.
It's great. And so it's As Is, and it's published by Omnidon. Well, that's all the voices from the burning bush we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundations.org. Thanks so much to my guests. Here's your chance, everybody. Tyrone Williams, Billy Joe Harris, Aldon Nielsen, Erica Hunt, and to Poem Talk's director and engineer today, Zach Carduner, and Madeline Song. Is Madeline still back there? And to Poem Talk's editor, the same amazing Zach Carduner, and a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of Poem Talk. In our next episode, Jacob Edmond, who will have come all the way from New Zealand, and Sonia Pasmantir and Huda Fakhruddin will join me to talk about Kamau Brathwaite's amazing poem, Negus. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us again for that or another episode of Poem Talk, and thank you to our live audience.
We have a hard stop at 1:15, but we would love for you to ask questions of any of us. Now's the time. You can also run in and get another sandwich, starting with Ron. Do we want a
Yes.
portable mic?
Or he can just use
He
this.
could, yeah, here.
We'll get a portable mic so we get this for the record.
But I'm stationary. The one person that did not get mentioned that I was sure was going to be mentioned in this talk was your mother.
Yes.
And her relationship to photography and to your poetry and to your background and that whole history.
Yeah.
Can you address that?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Because the story in that book is about my mother telling me a story that she told me many times. My mother is 101 years old. She was born in 1918 in Harlem. That's right. So, yes, and there's even a photo of her at age 5 in the book. And the story that she tells is when she was about the age of 5, she was taken on a trip to see her grandparents. And her grandparents lived in Jamaica. So she stayed. Her mother took her, and she was delighted to see that she had an older sister that she didn't even know about. And she was so pleased. But the next morning when she woke up, her mother was gone.
Wow.
And the reason her mother went and had taken her to Jamaica to
This is
visit
in
her
the book. It's in
grandparents.
the book we just read, yeah.
The reason she had brought her there was so that her mother could go and work in a house, work as a servant. Yeah. Right? So, and she didn't see her mother for 3 years.
Amazing.
I mean, in those days, they didn't have, Spock or whatever. They didn't say, oh, what's
It's not a good
impact of
idea to leave your
your
child for
child?
3 years in another place.
It's in another place. But so she told this story to me when she was, she told me this story when, of course, but she told the story over and over and over again as she got older, because this really shaped her, about, mothers and children and so forth, and duty and all that. Her mother did return for her eventually. This happens, by the way,
yes.
now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Happens all the time now, and so that's it's such a I wonder how it shapes me. I'm sure it does in some way.
Yeah.
So thank you for asking, because that's one of the stories that's the spring, the inner spring of the book, the story. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ron, for the question. Bob has a question, and we have a mic for you, Bob.
I guess I have the urge to ask Erica what it's like to listen to these people, very articulate people, talking about your work in such great detail and from so long ago and so forth.
Great question.
How did it feel to you?
Now I know how my students feel. Anyway, when we workshop a poem, I realized that the poem is no longer, it's an artifact. And I can explain the conditions under which it was generated, but it's an artifact. And so people will take it as they take it. It is a letter to the future. It's a letter to a reader that has their own experiences and sets of associations, and hopefully there's enough sort of, enough sensorium in the words, enough happening in imagery, sound, and, form that people then begin to pull out their own resonance.
Was there a moment when somebody said something that made you think, "Oh yeah, I didn't"?
Oh yeah,
Or
oh yeah.
Was Al overreading?
That's just a rhetorical ploy, by the way. I use it all the time.
There was really, I think something Aldon said that I thought was really, you pointed to this tense that
Right.
that sort of made up tense, and I said, oh yeah, that's
And also connecting back to the earlier poems.
Yeah, that was
great.
helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Bob. Another question for any of us? It should be on.
Okay. Hi, Professor Hunt. Very nice to meet you. This is my first time to be here and my first time to America. So
You just
I feel
arrived a
quite
week
at
ago
home.
from China,
Yeah.
yes?
welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah. Very nice talk.
Can we give her a warm welcome? For
Thank you. I want to talk about that poem, Should You Find Me. First, I want to ask, may I interpret the speaker in the poem just as you, the poet yourself? Can I do this in this poem?
Some version of me. Yeah.
Some version.
We kind of change over time, and I wrote this a while ago, and then it got edited so much, obviously,
Apparently.
that it has a resemblance to me, but it's also I wouldn't put an equal sign.
Okay.
Sort of, more or less. Yes.
The topic you mentioned, stepping into a world.
Yes.
I'm interested in what's going on in the mind of the speaker here in this poem. Is she or he very willingful to step into the world, or is he or she just passively being pulled into the world? This is the first question. And the second, as the result, this person has finally been pulled into the world, but she may find that this world might be different from that one in his or her mind in the first place. So are they different? If the difference, the gap is very large, how is this person handle the situation?
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah,
It was
that's a great question. It is a really good question. There's some reticence. There's some hesitation. There is hesitation, and I think that was detected by my interlocutors here. There's a hesitation, and then there's a decision to enter into the world. It is a chaotic world. I think the last few lines of the poem it is muted, but it is an assertion that if you have the long view, it's not about, sort of moving through the world speedily, but maybe moving through the world a little bit slowed down. Now that I'm past this point, if you will, I've been talking about how poetry is helpful because it slows things down, because it makes us look and look again, and that's actually a useful practice in being in the world, in a discerning way, in an ethical way. To be ethical is to slow it down. They want us to speed up, and so maybe it's about looking carefully and making the connections and giving ourselves a chance to breathe and then move and act.
What a lovely answer to the question. Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then I'm going to give Erica a chance to say whatever she wants to say by conclusion.
I just wanted to make a
Teddy,
comment.
hi.
Hi.
Oh, and Amber Rose has one. So this,
Okay.
can you ask
Thank you.
quick questions?
Yes, very
We'll get
quick.
2 in. No, really, because we have a hard stop at 1:15. I want Amber Rose to get.
I just want to say real quickly, if you find me, if you look for me, reminded me of Marcus Garvey saying, "Look for me in the whirlwind," which is which is why Lamont Steptoe named his press Whirlwind Press. And I thought you were going to talk. It reminded me something Al was saying about the Whitman line about I am large, I contain multitudes. Slipped in there also.
Yes,
But-
yes.
Thank you, Teddy.
Thank you. Thank
Amber
you.
Rose Johnson.
Thank all of you so much,
Yes.
and thank you, Erica, for
Thank
being
you. You had a
here
good time?
and sharing your work. Yeah, it's been fantastic. So my question was actually along the lines of this Whitmanian question, because it's also just been in our conversations in the last few days here. I'm wondering about this word feminist that came up in your introduction, and how you relate to that word, but in thinking about a sort of Whitmanian tradition or a Whitmanian influence that you're talking about coming in on your poem, but I'm wondering what the Black feminist revision is and where the impulse for that kind of revision comes from. Is it something about a kind of multitude that you're finding in yourself? Is it something about the sort of lineage of these other folks who made way for you to be in this writing space that you brought in? Yeah, so a question about the Black feminist revision to the Whitmanian plenary.
That's a great question, and I don't know if I can answer it quickly, because I would have to sort of circle it a little bit. I do think I'm more conscious of lineages, than I was in the past, and having multiple lineages. I'm also aware that at the time I wrote this, I was close to burnout. I mean, I was doing so much. From the job, yeah. I was doing, I mean, I really felt like I had the weight of the world, So, and I don't think that's an uncommon thing. I think that most of the Black women and most women that I know are like doing 2 and 3 and 4 shift. I mean, that's what we do if you're awake. And the idea that you have to actually kind of take on or be available to actually the other dysfunctions in the world and do something about it, or feel called to do something about it, as I do, seem like, how? So, and yet we must act, and yet we must act together, So if there is a Black feminist revisionist view to this, it is my conviction. People make other people. Is really a reference to Ubuntu, which is that I am because we are, right? So it is also people make each other. We are interrelated, and we exist and go through the world, and we're able to sustain ourselves as activists, as writers, as artists, because we are in community. So that's, I think that's the worldview that feeds this poem and many of the poems. So is that?
That was a perfect final question, because it enabled Erica to say something important in general about, and it turned out to endorse. Yeah, it turned out to endorse the decision of talking about this poem. I want to remind everybody that we have copies of Veronica, Sweet and X Parts, and we have copies of Black Women Radical Writing, and that Erica will be giving a reading at 6 p.m. in this same space, and both those books will be available again. Also, one last thing, at 3:30. The 5 of us will be going into the studio to record an open-ended, no-agenda interview conversation with Erica about her work and about poetry in general, I'm sure. And there's a little room in the studio for 2 or 3 people who would like to join us. So if you feel like you want to join us, either show up and hope there's a space, or let me know in advance at 3:30. We'd love to have a couple people in the room. And then again at 6 o'clock. We'll be back for a reading. So can you help me thank all these great people?
Where's the studio? In the politest way possible, I want to ask you to get out of this room. We have to turn it over for a class, but feel free to hang out in the living room and greet these wonderful people. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.